What's going on, everybody? Last week, I asked a question I was super curious about. It was actually sort of like a question that was asked of me in one of my Q&A videos. And I basically said, hey guys, if you had $1,000 to buy 3 cards to start a vintage collection, you don't have anything yet, what 3 cards would you buy? Now, when I did this, I was mostly thinking the takeaway would be, oh, well, the cards I would like would be some of the key cards of favorite players, or some of the cards from certain sets that people are interested in. And to a certain extent, that was the response. But there were some things about the responses that really, really surprised me. You know, we don't really know what everyone else is collecting. We don't get to see inside other people's collections. And that's one of the reasons I love doing the monthly pickup videos, which, by the way, I'm putting the deadline at Wednesday. If you have not yet submitted your favorite pickup from the month of September, do that in the next 2 days or so, because I'm going to close that so I can make that video. But the point of what I'm getting at is we don't know what's happening with other people. So sometimes what happens is we think we know what other collectors in the hobby are doing based on what we see on like YouTube channels or maybe at our local card show. Though that's the only insight we have into what other people are adding to their collections, because we're not there to actually physically see their collections. Well, people that have YouTube channels and show their cards on YouTube aren't necessarily the average everyday collector. Jason is. My buddy Jason, Everyday Card Collector, is his channel name. But most of us, not us, most YouTube channels are people that have been in it for a while. People who maybe have a decent amount of funds to be able to show their collection. But I don't think in most cases, the channels that at least that I'm watching are people that have similar budgets to me and similar budgets to the average collector. So I guess what I'm saying is I was kind of expecting one thing from some of these responses, but instead at times I got something else. Now, for example, the eras in which people collect, you kind of think, oh yeah, the 50s and 60s, those tend to be a little bit more popular. But when I'm turning on channels, I'm seeing tons and tons of pre-war cards and high-end, cards from the Gaudi sets and the T206 sets and the turn of the century. But that's not what the common response was here. The common response was from the average collector, which really was sort of not what I expected. But I totally get it and it makes sense. Let's stop me talking about it and listen to what some people had to say about what cards it is that they would pick up with $1,000 if they had to start their collection from scratch. For the Vintage Starter Collection, here is what you should buy for $1,000. A 1960 Topps Mickey Mantle, a 1956 Topps Jackie Robinson, and a 1957 Topps Hank Aaron. All 3 of these guys seem to hold their value and almost never go down. Buy them raw or low grade with good centering and eye appeal. My friend Dean says a 52 Topps Yogi, a 1956 Topps Hank Aaron, and a 1959 Topps Bob Gibson, all 2s. For this week's question on what 3 vintage cards you should buy if starting with $1,000, a 1968 Topps Johnny Bench rookie and a PSA SGC 6, a 1956 Topps Jackie Robinson in a PSA SGC 2, and a 1960 Topps Willie Mays in a PSA SGC 6. My general opinion is Mays is the best five-tool player of all time. Johnny Bench is the best catcher of all time, and Jackie is as iconic as they come. Yet all three of these cards are still reasonably affordable, are unlikely to ever lose much value, and look beautiful on display. Each of them carry their own talking points if someone sees your collection and wants to ask about it. Plus, when all three are in horizontal configuration, they'll fit more space in your display when you're starting fresh. Kind of like that hold the fish further out from your body when getting the picture of it approach to a collection. I think I'd buy a Mantle for around $500. I prefer a 56, which was his Triple Crown year. I'd then spend $250 on a Jackie Robinson 56 and a Clemente 56 as well. Can you tell I really like the 56 top set? I've changed my collecting habits to concentrate on less cards but more expensive ones. For me, I enjoy the bigger cards, where the smaller, less expensive cards aren't really valued after some time. And my dad says, if I didn't have any cards with $1,000 in my pocket to start a collection, my primary goal would be to get a Mantle. It would be a 1959 as the newest I would purchase. Normally I would say even older than that, but I do like that particular card. Beyond that, anything else would be far less important, so most of the cash would go for the Mantle. The other cards would be a 58 Mays and a 58 Aaron. That would be the bare bones of a new collection. My friend Tony says, I just did a little research for your question. I would buy the three following cards that I just found on an eBay search. All are Topps cards. First, a 1956 Jackie Robinson. An SGC 2.5 centered with great eye appeal was $440. Second, a 1960 Mickey Mantle. An SGC 2.5, decent centering and good eye appeal, was $383. Third, a 1965 Hank Aaron BVG 3.5, nice card for $175. There you have it. Some classic Hall of Famers and big names in the hobby for right around $1,000. I would need to pay taxes and shipping. I would borrow that money from my wife. All right. To me, that was super interesting. Even that last answer right there. That last answer was really surprising. So that's my buddy Tony. He's got a newer channel with an amazing collection. And his channel, I'll put a link in the description below. But it's Southern Collector 14, I think. And I'll put it on the screen here too. And the thing about Tony is a lot of Tony's pickups, like his first video were all of his Shoeless Joe Jackson cards, which are amazing. You know, his second video was about his Babe Ruth autograph ball and the story and the provenance behind the ball. But then you say, well, what cards would Tony pick to start a collection and with $1,000? And it wasn't pre-war stuff. You could buy some pre-war stuff. You could buy some Gaudies. You could buy some exhibits. You could buy a lot of things with this budget size. But what he chose and what most people chose were some of the all-time greats, big names from the 50s and 60s. A lot of people talked about Mantle. They talked about Mays. They talked about Aaron. They talked about Berra, which was interesting. Now, I compiled some stats of all the responses because there were a lot of responses and it would be very difficult for me to read every single one. And so what I did is I picked a few that showed kind of a variety. But I am going to later in this episode talk about the trends, break it down as to what people recommended. But Jackie Robinson, Mickey Mantle, when you think about the foundation of most people's collections, it's a card or two in a mid to low grade of some of those key players from the 50s and 60s. There was no mention of guys like Ted Kluszewski or Rocky Colavito or Bobby Richardson or some of these very good players that, there weren't even many mentions, if any, of sort of that sort of second or third tier Hall of Fame player. They were all the marquee names. And they weren't just, see, people say all the time, nobody cares about low grade cards, Greg. If the card's off centered and it has low corners, that card's a dime a dozen. That card is not rare. Nobody wants it. But then I just asked all of you, what cards would you want? And people were like, a 56 Jackie Robinson in a 2.5. A 59 Mickey Mantle that I could buy for, $500-600. Those were the sorts of answers. A 1960 Mickey Mantle in a 3. Most people out there that are into vintage cards want those big names, and it doesn't have to be a pristine card. And you say, well, Greg, the only reason they said those is because you gave the limit of $1,000. Well, guess what? Most people that are getting into the hobby right now, if somebody said, I want to start collecting vintage baseball cards, which happens every day, there are people who make that decision and decide to start collecting vintage cards. Most of them don't have tens of thousands of dollars to start throwing around buying Ty Cobbs and Babe Ruths. They just don't. They don't have the money to buy a PSA 8 1959 Mickey Mantle. They just want to get one for like $500. The reason I used $1,000 in the budget is not because that was a crazy example of crazy, wild, big cards. It's because that's what most people would have to work with if they entered the hobby. So this was about the average everyday collector. What would they want in their collection? And the names that came up were the biggest names, and the grades that were mentioned and the price ranges that were mentioned were pretty regular type grades. Lots of cards in 2s and 3s and 4s. So when we talk about what is the long-term demand for vintage cards, is the long-term demand for vintage cards PSA 8s of cards from the 50s? Well, I think a lot of people would like to have those, but those aren't necessarily realistic for most people. But we do see some of those pop up on our favorite YouTube channels. But a lot of those people that we see pop up on our favorite YouTube channels are guests. And the reason they're guests is because they have incredible collections. Or people that have been in the hobby for a really long time and bought a lot of those cards before they got to the prices that they are now. So, long story short, I learned a lot from this. And I was kind of expecting one thing, but what I took away, at least from this first selection of responses, is people want Mays, people want Mantle, people want Jackie Robinson, people want Hank Aaron. They want the big names, and they want the big names more than they want the big grades. They want to have the cards, and they want to have the cards of the iconic guys. So it kind of makes sense why a Rocky Colavito in a rookie card from the 57 top set in a 4 is not very expensive, because that's pretty far down the list of what most people would want. Now, it's not that he's not wanted. That's not what I'm saying, but what I am saying is that when we're prioritizing the cards and the players and the years that we want, it's the big names. It's the big names. And if you have limited funds, and people say, well, nobody cares about the really good player anymore, the borderline Hall of Famer guy anymore, the guy who just missed the Hall of Famer. Is it that they don't care? Or is it that the prices of cards have gotten to the point where you have limited funds and you have to spend them in a place, and before you get the Rocky Colavito from the 57 set, you probably want the Mantle and the Mays and the Aaron from the 57 set. So because of the prices of those big cards, when people put the foundation of their collection together, it seems to me, I mean, I just heard a lot of people lay it out there. They're not worried about getting a high grade card. The average guy, they just want to have a Mantle in the collection. They just want to have a Jackie Robinson in the collection. And again, I'm going to take a closer look at all of the responses here in a couple of minutes. But first, let's look at another common, not very common, but another mention of a different type of collection right here. To answer your question for next week, since I am a big vintage football fan, and since rookie QBs are the way to go for starting a collection, my choices are the 1948 Leaf Sammy Baugh, the 1948 Leaf Bobby Lane, and the 1948 Leaf Sid Luckman. Not only are these three very beautiful and colorful cards, but these three quarterbacks were the cream of the crop in their day and a great way to start a vintage football collection. What is your definition of vintage? I'm going to assume before 1980 for my answer, and I would buy the following. Number 1, a 1971 Terry Bradshaw rookie for $850. Number 2, a 1972 Roger Staubach rookie for $100. Number 3, a 1969 Bart Starr for $50. Yep, I am a football collector. My top collected football collections are the players above plus Barry Sanders, Peyton Manning, Walter Payton, and the Steelers from the 1970s. Thanks for your videos. Okay, so there are some vintage football collectors. And as you all know, I love vintage football cards. And, I collect a variety of different players. I have several on my list. I'm sporadically picking them up all the time. But here's something interesting. Those two comments listed 6 vintage football cards, right? 2 people listed 3 vintage football cards, and then another person 3 vintage football cards. And every single one was a quarterback. Every single one, every football card that was mentioned was a quarterback. Jim Brown wasn't mentioned. Gale Sayers wasn't mentioned. Larry Zonka, I could go through the list. No, none of them were mentioned. It was only quarterbacks. Now, I know that in modern cards and ultra modern cards, it's really about, Mahomes. And we all know that the quarterback is like a really obviously important part of the game. But back then, back in the 50s or the late 40s when that, Leaf set was printed, quarterbacks were obviously still very important because they got the ball right away. But there wasn't a lot of throwing. But it's still about the position, sort of like in baseball, all those guys that I've been mentioning, Mantle and Aaron and Mays, it's all about the power hitter. In football, it's about the quarterback. In baseball, it's about the power hitter. And not just the power hitter, but the cover boy. It's the guy who is like the centerpiece of the franchise. The guy on the program in the center of the shot. That's the guy that people want. Again, there are a lot of players that were really important to those 6 quarterbacks that allowed them to have time to scramble and time to throw and time to win games. But we focus on the quarterback. I've always assumed that, but I kind of grew up in an era of the running back, and the Barry Sanders, the Emmitt Smith, the Thurman Thomas, the Adrian Peterson. As I'm growing up watching those guys, it was like, if you've got a really good running back, you're set. Now we're in an era of the wide receiver because you're not allowed to touch him. You're not allowed to touch the quarterback. It's way easier to throw than it's ever been before. So everybody's just throwing like crazy. And so I've always had this interest in the all-time great running backs. But I just found that to be really interesting. Now, out of all of the responses, there was one basketball card mentioned. One. That surprised me. Far and away, it was baseball. But after baseball, it was football. Nobody mentioned a hockey card. One person mentioned one basketball card. Now, again, this is just a straw poll. This isn't anything scientific. But I do feel like we can learn from this of what the boots in the grounds are seeing. It's like when they make a law. As a teacher, I go through this all the time. They go, we've made this new law where, I'll give you an example. You're not allowed to suspend a student for defiance. And going to school or not going to school, cutting class, is a form of defiance. And screaming at a teacher or their classmates or cursing and causing a scene is defiance. So you can't suspend people for those things anymore. I don't know if they realize the fallout of a law like that. Maybe poll a few teachers like me. The boots on the ground know what's happening. The generals in the ivory towers don't necessarily know what's happening. And so asking others in the hobby, what are you actually buying? What are you actually collecting? What are the things you actually want and don't want? It kind of gives you an idea of what the future holds, right? So a few football mentions. There were two there, but all the football cards being quarterbacks was something that I noticed. Now, another thing that I noticed is the overwhelming majority of baseball cards were 50s and 60s, with a sprinkling of 70s, and not many pre-war, and not many newer. Now, I did say vintage. And everybody's definition of vintage is different. Some people would say vintage is anything from before 1990. Some would say 1980s. Some would say mid-70s. So I get that. But there were a few people who said, I'd pick up some cards that aren't from the 50s and 60s and the sprinkling of 70s. And let's take a look at a few of those. And then I want to look at some of the numbers that I crunched from all of your responses. Not just the responses that I'm reading here, but all of the responses, because the trends, I think, are really interesting. Let's take a look. My good pal Darren says, great video, Greg. 100% agree. Timing any market is impossible, but when it makes sense financially, and sell when you need to. For next week, if I had $1,000 to start collecting, I'd pick up a 1989 Upper Deck Griffey in a 9 for $200, a 1950 Bowman Barra in a 3 for $400, and a T206 Eddie Collins in a 2 for $400. I feel like those are all iconic cards from iconic sets spread across pre-war, golden era, and junk wax eras. It's a good foundation. For a future video, re-ask this question with a bigger budget, like Mike Petty sized. That could be a fun one. 3 cards for $1,000 to buy now? I would buy a centered low-grade 33 or 34 Gaudy Lefty Grove, Carl Hubble, and Dizzy Dean. Because they are 3 greats of the game that are undervalued in the market. And my Strongsville targets next year. All right. So there were a few people who said pre-war cards. My buddy Darren, I liked his approach. He said one kind of newer-ish card one kind of golden age card, and then one pre-war card. And he picked an Eddie Collins, who was a really, really good player, a really, really good hitter, and still fairly affordable. And then he said, well, and that Ken Griffey Jr. card, which is obviously a really important card. Now, some people would say, Darren, you broke the rules. It's not a vintage card. But I think what Darren was doing is just showing that the foundation of a collection should kind of be spread out over a few decades, not just focused on one. Whereas a lot of people focused on one. Now, the other one is about some really, really good pitchers from the pre-war era, right? Dizzy Dean, Lefty Grove, and Carl Hubble. Those guys were phenomenal. If you haven't looked up Lefty Grove's stats, look up his stats for a second. And if you're not familiar with them, you'll go, wow, I didn't realize he was that dominant. But his cards are very, very affordable. Which brings us back to, why are they affordable? Well, one of the reasons I think that one of my takeaways here is one person mentioned a Lefty Grove card, and you can buy his cards for under $1,000. So maybe the reason that Lefty Grove cards are so affordable is because they're not on people's radars. The average collector does not have Lefty Grove cards on their radar. Now, why are they as expensive as they are then? Well, one, he was unbelievable. And number two, his cards are not super common. They're not rare, but they're not like, 89 tops either. So anyway, I did like the fact that there were a few people who mentioned Gowdy, and a few people, or one person who mentioned a T206. There were a couple of people that mentioned pre-war, but almost everyone focused on the 50s and 60s, that golden age. So I want to look at a few stats with you, and I'm going to put a few things on the screen. The first thing I want to put on the screen is the breakdown by sport. So you can see here that 81.4% of the responses were baseball cards. That is an absolutely overwhelming majority. Baseball cards are king. Now, I've said for a while that I think football cards are undervalued and underappreciated, and I do still think that. And I have always recognized that baseball cards are the king of sports cards. My hypothesis is I think a lot of modern collectors who are predominantly football card collectors will eventually want to go to the security of some of the older cards. And when they do that, I think they'll go to older cards of the same sport that they're in. I also think that football cards are rarer than baseball cards. So because they're rarer, it doesn't take that big of a jump in demand for the prices to jump. Now, the other thing you'll see on there is the basketball card. Nobody really mentioned basketball. And the one card was Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt Chamberlain. No mention of Kareem, no mention of Maravich, no mention of Jerry West or Elgin Baylor or Bill Russell. Nobody mentioned any of those guys. No Julius Erving. It was only one person mentioned Wilt Chamberlain. So that was interesting. Now, the second graphic I want to put up on the screen is a breakdown by player. Now, this one was extremely interesting. People are always saying, Greg, whose cards do you think are going to go up in value and whose cards are going to hold value? And we all respond. We all know the answer is supply and demand. So if supply and demand is the answer, and most vintage cards have a fairly set supply at this point, The determining factor is going to be the demand. Who is there going to continue to be demand for? And number one on your list was Jackie Robinson. That was not what I expected. Now, I get it. I actually think that that's a really good answer. I think it's, should I even say the right answer? It's my opinion of the right answer. And then Mickey Mantle right behind him. Again, the iconic name, the iconic team, in a period of great success, a prolific player, a well-loved player across the league. So that makes a ton of sense. But then Yogi Berra, Willie Mays, and Hank Aaron. These are big names. Now, the thing about Yogi Berra, and one of the comments mentioned, is he's not just a baseball icon. He's sort of an American icon. The guy was literally in action on D-Day. He was in military action on D-Day. He is a guy who lived a long time, had a lot of great stories. My buddy Gary just sent me a video clip of him and Whitey Ford talking to Tim Russert, telling the story about the 4-ball story. Look up the 4-ball story, Whitey Ford, Yogi Berra, Tim Russert. A fantastic clip. And that's just Yogi. Who doesn't like Yogi Berra? I mean, he's just a likable guy. But there weren't these other names. It's the big names. People, if you want a collection, it has to have some of those guys in it, right? Now, the last graphic I'm going to put up here is the most popular cards that were mentioned. Look at that. The 1956 Topps Jackie Robinson had 6 people mention it. And to be honest with you, I thought it was more than 6. I may have even written that wrong. I thought it was more than 6. It was unbelievable how many people mentioned the 56 Topps Jackie Robinson, the last Jackie Robinson card. And Jackie Robinson being the player that was mentioned the most, his 56 Topps is the only Jackie Robinson card mentioned. And it might be because it's the most affordable, which it is. But there are others. The 54 and the 55 you could still buy for under $1,000 as well. So if you're saying, well, what does the future hold for cards? What players are going to hold their value? Which players are going to continue to have demand? Which cards are the ones that a lot of people believe in? Well, obviously this isn't a huge sample size. And obviously this is just anecdotal. It's not a scientific, process that I went through here. But I do think it gives a snapshot about the future. I really enjoyed this. And the variety of answers were all over the place. Now, the question for next week, I'm really interested in, and I'm going to talk about them next week. And I'm going to plan on using some of these. So my buddy Darren and I, right, we do each month, we do at least one off-topic episode. Usually one is just the two of us, and then one of us usually has a guest, and we kind of rotate months. This is my month for the guest, and I was able to secure Dr. Beckett. Yes, the guy with the price guide. He's going to be our guest on Off Topic, and we are going to be recording this with him in about a week. And so my question for all of you is, if you could ask one question to Dr. Beckett, what would the question be? And my plan is to present 2 or 3 of these questions to Dr. Beckett and see what he has to say. He's a really interesting guy. He's a very open guy. He's gotten to the point now where he gives his opinion on a lot of stuff, and obviously was behind the price guide for years and years and years. He led them while they got into grading, Beckett grading. And a few years ago, he sold the company. And so he's no longer the owner. But I know that he does still have a relationship. And I know that he still thinks fondly of them. And I know that, he built a lot of really close relationships along the way. Now, keep in mind, if I'm presenting a question to Dr. Beckett while, I'm doing this with Darren, if the question is super long and complicated, it might be kind of difficult to rattle the whole thing off to him. So keeping it somewhat brief, what's a question you want us to ask him? Now, next week, when I do this video, it will be before the interview. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the questions that you would ask him and the ones that I thought were particularly interesting and why, and then some of the ones that I am planning to take forward for that interview. I'm really, really excited to have Dr. Beckett on my channel, but I'm also excited to be able to share that opportunity with all of MidLife Nation and offer you all the opportunity to have your question asked to him on the channel in the discussion that I'm going to be doing with my buddy Darren of Return to Collecting. So submit those questions for Dr. Beckett. I look forward to seeing what you all come up with. And I appreciate everybody who took the time to share what they would spend their $1,000 on if they were starting a vintage collection.